Okay, Norwegian Wood. Obviously one of Murakami's big three books. The other two being Wind Up Bird Chronicle and Kafka on the Shore. I know a lot of people would also include 1Q84 among his major works, but I think that one's much more contentious. I know personally 1Q84 is actually the only Murakami book that I will never reread because I think it's particularly the third book is just so overwritten. But yeah, and as I've said in the past, Wind Up Bird Chronicle and Kafka on the Shore and Killing Commendatore are three books that are too personal to me. I will never do a proper review of them. So in that sense, this is probably the closest thing you'll get to the big Murakami book from me. I might talk about some of the others on specific subjects, but never the overall book. But as regards the overall book with Norwegian Wood, there's one video on YouTube that I really think you should watch before you read this book, and I really just think you should watch it in general. And it's Folding Ideas, Dan Olson, and I'll put a link to it in the comment, in the comment and the description of the video, Decoding Metaphor, because I think it's absolutely essential to understanding not just Murakami, but a lot of media. And it's the way he articulates it that I think makes it very easy to pass along to others. So rather than sit here and try to stumble through my own sort of explanation, go watch his video. Because if you approach Norwegian Wood at face value, you will absolutely end up, I think, missing the forest for the trees, pardon the pun, and not quite get what the book is about. And I say that because I have read this book a few times. It's never been one of my favorite Murakami works. It's always been kind of middle of the road for me. But reading it again, something really stood out to me this time that changed my understanding of the book completely and made everything about the book lock into place. Which is a lot of people treat Norwegian Wood like a romance story. I've heard that they made a movie, and if I had to guess what they did in the movie, the reception to the movie is pretty mixed. It's not like terrible like a lot of Hear the Wind Sing or whatever, some of Murakami's other movies, but it's not great either. And like, Burning or Drive My Car. So I imagine what happened is they focused in really on adapting the romance side of the story, because that's what a lot of people talk about. Even in the translator's note at the end by J. Rubin, he mentions that a lot of people perceive it as a simple love story, but it's not. Usually I would say, like, that's my interpretation, and obviously in a literal sense, that's my interpretation. But I think that the reason that the movie missed so much is that if you just read it as a romance story, you end up missing the whole point of the book. Because, to be honest, this is not a romance story. This is the after of a romance story. Because the sort of setup or premise of the book is that you have Toru Watanabe and... names. I'm so bad with names. All right, here we go. You have the main character, Toru Watanabe, and then you have his friend, Kizuki, and his friend's childhood friend, Naoko. And together, when they were in high school and junior high, they sort of formed a trio. Now, granted, Kizuki and Naoko had been childhood friends. They had been extremely close together and were pretty much always destined to be together. They always got along really, really well. And Toru was the third wheel. And this is the romance story. Kizuki is the protagonist. Toru is the friend. And Naoko, nice. Naoko is the childhood, the neighbor girl who he grew up with, the childhood friend who he's destined to be with. Only the twist is Kizuki kills himself. And all this happens before the story begins. And then Norwegian Wood is Naoko and Toru, the friend, who is now the protagonist, trying to figure out how to survive, how to go on living in the wake of Kizuki's death. So this is not a romance story. This is the sequel to the romance story, once the romance went horribly, horribly wrong. And in that sense, that okay. So now we're kind of into the recommendation. Obviously, I would recommend this book. It's kind of an odd place to start if you want to understand a lot of Murakami's works, just because there's no magical realism. But if you don't like magical realistic stuff, then this is absolutely the book to read by Murakami. It's not a horrible place to start either. It's just mostly, again, unique amongst his work insofar as it doesn't have the magical realist stuff. But you still need that appreciation for symbolism and metaphor in order to understand and appreciate what's going on in the story. So don't think that just because there's no magical realist elements, that it's somehow a more straightforward or easy to understand story, because that's not it at all. So with that out of the way, pros and cons, I'm just going to skip the pros and cons part. Because I want to talk about really the story, about my experience reading the story, and this interpretation. So from here on out, it's just going to be spoilers. Read the book if you haven't. It's a great book, a fantastic book. Like I said, please watch the Decoding Metaphors video first. I think it will really, really help you to understand the book, especially the ending, which confuses a lot of people, but makes perfect sense if you sort of read it, again, symbolically. So, getting into full spoilers, this is sort of how my reading experience went. For people who have already read the book and are looking for more analysis, there are two big themes in the book. Obviously, I said living with death, and I think that is absolutely the primary theme. And you see it a lot because one of the biggest quotes from the book, hang on, let me find it. Okay, this is one of the big sort of quotes from the book that you see a lot. Death is not the opposite of life, but an innate part of life. And much like the quote that also comes from this book, probably the quote from Murakami that I see quoted the most, if you only read what other people are reading, you only think what other people are thinking. The context of that quote is actually quite a bit interesting. It's being said by a very narcissistic, egotistical person. And he goes on to to say some pretty critical things of other people. In the same way that, like, on its own, it's a good quote, the context kind of shifts things slightly. The book goes on then here with that quote. This is sort of the character's philosophy at the start of the book. But then, after Naoko kills himself, it goes on. By living our lives, we nurture death. True as that might be, it was only one of the truths that we had to learn. What I learned from Naoko's death was this. No truth can cure the sorrow we feel from losing a loved one. No truth, no sincerity, no strength, no kindness can cure that sorrow. All we can do is see it through to the end and learn something from it. But what we learn will be no help in facing the next sorrow that comes to us without warning. So, it's just that idea that the thought, the sort of quote that a lot of people throw out to try to sum things up really quickly and succinctly is not the whole of what Murakami is trying to say here. It is, in fact, the sort of starting point from the journey. And basically right from the start of the book. And the thing that really not tipped me off, but made me decide to approach this as not the sort of love story that a lot of people treat it as, but as the sequel, was at the end of the very first chapter. It ends with, the thought fills me with an almost unbelievable sorrow because Naoko never really loved me. And while it's easy to say that this is sort of the protagonist's sort of memories and how he's remembering things, and it's hard to say whether Naoko really loved him or not, I think it definitely clued me into the idea that there is much more going on here than just romance, because right from the start, Murakami sort of dispels that idea, I think, with this line. And what you're instead left with is, again, the story of these two people who are suffering in the wake of their friend's suicide. The timeline of the book is actually quite short, and it's easy to forget because even the characters themselves will mention multiple times, like, oh, that seems like it happened ages ago, but it only happened like 4 months ago. And it's important in the sense of appreciating that for them, the death of Kizuki is a recent thing. And this is them trying to, like I've said multiple times, trying to move on. But the death sort of shakes them to their foundation. They haven't figured out yet what they're trying to live for. And every time the protagonist is around Naoko, he's sort of constantly reminded of death. And Naoko's sort of attitude and form and the way she's described as this sort of ethereal, untouchable beauty is, I think, sort of very reminiscent of death and of somebody who has sort of resigned themselves. And at the same time, someone who... the commune, I don't want to call it an asylum because that has kind of odd connotations, which admittedly a commune does as well. But basically the place where she is living, where Toru sort of goes and visits her, very much to me kind of mirrors the sort of healing process that a lot of people go to when they're wounded, falling back on sort of comforts and simplicity and open conversations and honesty and whatnot. And it's a very good place and a very supportive and healing place. But it's also very separated from reality. And I think it's really important to note that it's not a place that you leave and come back to over and over and over, nor is it a place that you live. It is a temporary place, a temporary state for sort of healing and self-discovery and whatnot. And all of the struggle that Naoko is going through, which, again, at the end of the book, Toru explicitly states that she has chosen death. She has pretty much always chosen death from the start, is in contrast to Midori, who I think is a really powerful character. I never really appreciated Midori as much until reading this again, in terms of just everything that she went through as a person. Because again, if you want further evidence that death is really the theme of this story and not romance, it's not just Toru and Naoko who have suffered through a lot of death in their life. Midori as well, not just with her father, but with her mother, and she says the rest of her family. She says explicitly, it runs in her family, these kinds of slow deaths that her father worked his whole life to build up this place, and then her mother's illness cost them all their savings, and then her father's illness pretty much wiped the rest out. And sure, in the end, they do sell the shop and whatnot, but ultimately, she even mentions that like this is what his legacy amounted to. And she herself, I mean, had to do all the cooking because they didn't cook. Mentions the sort of strict way that she was raised, which makes her rebellious attitude make more sense, but that she really was never totally loved as a child. She never felt that unconditional love. And when she mentions and describes love as, her sort of really crazy description of love, when it's like, it was, hold on, I'll go look up the exact quote. All right, here we go. I'm looking for selfishness, perfect selfishness. Like, say I tell you I want to eat strawberry shortcake, and you stop everything you're doing and run out to buy it for me, and you come back out of breath and get down on your knees and hold the strawberry shortcake out to me, and I'd say I don't want it anymore and throw it out the window. That's what I'm looking for. That sort of idea of just a selfless devotion of just loving someone to the extent that it's not about exchange. It's not, that everything isn't quantified as this kind of exchange, but that you just do things for the other person because you like them. It really, to me, indicates how lacking it sort of was in her family, that she feels that way, that everything was always this exchange that had to be evened out. And yet she continues to fight against it all, where Naoko represents a sort of surrender to death, then Midori represents the exact opposite, a very much strong desire to fight against death, to live, to embrace life, despite all the death that is around her. And her sexuality, her liberation is an extension of that. And I think that her continued fighting is really impressive in spite of what all she's gone through. The fact that she continues to try to be an upbeat person in spite of the fact that several times throughout the story, she confesses how absolutely terrified and lost she really is. And I feel like when I read conversations about this book or analyses of this book, Midori's struggles really get swept under the rug. And it's such an injustice to her character, because I think she sums up something really profound about sort of life and how we live when they're outside on the veranda while the other house is burning down. She says, and again, I'm going to pause the video to look it up here. All right, here we go. But dying itself, I'm not afraid of. Really, like here, I'd just be overcome with smoke and lose consciousness and die before I knew it. That doesn't frighten me at all, compared with the way I saw my mother and a few relatives die. All my relatives die after suffering with some terrible illness. It's in the blood, I guess. It's always a long, long process. And at the end, you almost can't tell whether a person is alive or dead. All that's left is pain and suffering. Midori put a Marlboro between her lips and lit it. That's the kind of death that frightens me. The shadow of death that slowly, slowly eats away at the region of life, and before you know it, everything's dark and you can't see, and the people around you think of you as more dead than alive. I hate it. I couldn't stand it. That, to me, sums up the emotional death that Watanabe is fighting against throughout the whole book. And I think that where Naoko, like I said, represents a sort of surrender to death, Midori represents, like I said, the fight against death. And Toru and the sort of push and pull between the two of them is a sort of reflection of his own inner turmoil, his own struggles with death. But I think that there's a sort of tendency to sort of underestimate Murakami's characters, because sometimes they do tend to be more metaphorical, and I'm describing this as a metaphorical struggle, but like I said, Midori is a very, very realized character. And I think the fact that Naoko remains kind of such a mystery is part of the point, and part of her character is that even though she went to this place, even though she was in a place where she is described as having these sort of open conversations, and she does have a few seemingly open conversations, there's this sense, given her actions towards the end, that she never really was open. And I think that when she talks about her inability to sort of have sex again, to get wet again, it's a reflection of this sort of inability to open herself up and be vulnerable, which is something that she struggled with even with Kizuki. So there's that element really of just her never really being able to be open, is the sense that I get. Never really being able to be honest, of always being sort of closed off. And this is the way that the protagonist is described several times throughout the story. When Midori goes through her phase of ignoring him, she does so by describing him as being very closed off, as sort of keeping everything to himself when she writes the note to him. That he helped her so much that when she wants to help him, he can't open himself. He can't be honest with someone else. And I think it's also to sort of further reinforce this interpretation. After Toru goes to the camp and comes back to the normal world and meets up with, he has a hard time readjusting. And he does meet up with Midori, and she does kind of pull him back to reality. And I believe her exact words were something like, you've looked dead. In fact, I'll go ahead and look it up again. Okay, apologies. She says, her quote is, "Hey, what's wrong with you? You've got this spaced outlook. Your eyes aren't focused." "I'm okay," I said. "I just got back from a trip and I'm kind of tired." "You look like you've seen a ghost." So again, kind of having that implication of otherworldliness, of having passed over to a place that's a bit beyond life. So, and the only person that really Toru is able to, I think, fully connect with is Reiko, who is the sort of third pin, and I think really of them all, mirrors Toru the most closely. I think Reiko is a fascinating character because she is somebody whose life has fallen apart completely, utterly and completely fallen apart twice. First with her piano playing, and then again with her husband. And it was, in both cases, not anything that she could control. And it's how, even though her life has fallen apart, she, like, after the first time, she lost something. And she tried to rebuild herself, tried to come together, and actually managed to make something new and make something work. And then she collapsed again. And in spite of that, once again, she is struggling to gather herself, struggling to collect herself, and at the end of the book, ultimately leaves the place to try and make something again. She is another person who is constantly struggling against life and the sort of unfairnesses and challenges of life, and constantly reinventing herself and struggling. And I think what she and the main character really have in common, and how they end up connecting so much, is that they're both in this sort of intermediary place between their old lives and their new lives. And that's where the scene at the end, I know I've seen a lot of people on like Reddit really have issue with the fact that she and Toru end up having sex. But I honestly think a lot of people need to get over their discomfort of sex, because this is somebody who, you have Toru, who is miserable because Naoko, not only has Naoko died, but it's the lack of ceremony about it. It's the fact that everything about her life was so sad and so depressing. And then you have Reiko, who, again, is trying to make a new go at life, who had a husband that she loved, who has a daughter that she loved, and that all fell apart. And she went to the sort of commune where she was able to sort of put herself back together, become somebody who could support other people, and now has come out and is once again re-entering the real world. And she's scared. She says she's scared. So you have two people who are, frankly, both facing life, both ready to try and reinvent themselves, but who are both extremely frightened of that. And they join together, and metaphorically, it's an affirmation of life, but physically, it just is something that they feel that closeness to each other, and it feels good. And again, both as a metaphorical affirmation of life, it's great, but also just as a experience, it feels good. And I don't understand, like, if it's the age gap, then come the fuck on. And if it's the idea that she's like somehow a senior to him, then maybe, but she's also in her own way just as confused and just as frightened. I think maybe in terms of experience, just raw age, sure, she's more experienced, but they're both frightened and they're both vulnerable, and they both are able to share with each other what they perceive as a sort of affirmation of life. And I think that, just reading it again, rather than being gross or horrifying or anything, it's beautiful. It's two people who've just had such shit circumstances finding each other. And yeah, they don't literally love each other, but just for this moment, they're able to share a part of themselves with each other. And I have no problem with that. Which then leads us to the ending of him calling out to Midori, of him choosing Midori, which he says, he just sort of, he says it, but that I love you, that I'd never leave you. And then Reiko affirms that he had chosen her already. And again, Midori is to him sort of life, to experience life, to enjoy living life. And a lot of people, ask the question at the end whether or not, Midori responded to him, whether or not he ended up with Midori. And nothing at the start suggests one way or another. And this is where I go back to the folding ideas video of it doesn't really matter whether Midori accepted him or left him. What matters, the point of the story, the heart of this story, is that ultimately Toru chose life. It says multiple times that he's going to keep on living, but really throughout most of the experience of Norwegian Wood, when he's not with Midori, he's living, but he's not really alive. Or rather, it's probably the other way around. He's alive, but he's not really living. He just kind of goes to class. He doesn't have many friends. He's not really invested in anything. He's not even really interested in his future. He's just taking play classes and drama classes because they're kind of easy. He doesn't super feel invested or interested in anything. He is, as Midori described, sort of emotionally gone. The shadow of death is sort of clinging to him. And by fully committing himself to Midori, he is committing himself to life and living. And when he looks out at the end, when he says, I called out to Midori from, when she asks, where are you? He doesn't know where he's at. Not literally. He's like, what street am I on? Which I know, I don't think most people take it that way, but it's where he is emotionally. Where am I now? I don't know. I don't know where I'm at. I'm still hurt. I'm still wounded. I'm still stuck with all these questions. But still, I call out to life. I call out to living. I want to go on finding reasons to live, finding things to live for, even though I know I'm going to carry this pain with me for the rest of my existence. And that, to me, is the heart of Norwegian Wood. And it's why the ending, I think, is so beautiful, why it makes perfect sense, why a lot of the book just clicks into place when you stop looking at it as a romance and start looking at it as, like I said, the sort of follow-up, as a story, a journey of somebody. It is a coming-of-age story, which I don't usually like, and it, maybe part of why I don't treat it the same that I do Kafka on the Shore, Norwegian Wood, or not Kafka on the Shore, Wind Up Bird Chronicle, or Killing Commendatore. But it is a coming-of-age story, not of romance, but of learning how to live life with mortality, with death, with loss, and to still struggle in spite of it. And I think that when you focus in on the romance, you miss that side of the story. And I think that the reason that the movie probably doesn't work is that whether people realize it or not, this sort of stuff that's going on in the background is what adds weight to the story. And when you focus in on it, you end up missing it. I mentioned one other key aspect of the book, and there's not really been a neat way to slot it in here, so I'll probably end up repeating what I just said. But the other aspect of the story that takes a bit of a backseat, it doesn't quite have the same omnipresence as death does, but it's class. Murakami himself went to school during the Student Revolution. It ends up being a recurring theme in a few of his works. It pops up again in Kafka on the Shore. And the sort of class issues end up being another big aspect of the book. And you see this with Nagasa or Nagasawa. I can't remember which it is. Chotomate kudasai. All right, Nagasawa. Who I think is a really interesting character because he is such an ass and so deeply unlikable in so many ways. And yet at the same time, he is a very competent person. I hesitate there because he's a competent person while being a complete shit as a human. He doesn't care about the people around him. He doesn't care about the emotions of others. And more or less to him, the whole world exists to serve him. And the thing is, he is a very privileged person. But at the same time, while it would be easy to write a character like this as somebody who is sort of a Nepo baby who does nothing, who's incompetent, and who just gets everything handed to him. Nagasawa is not that. He does still work. He does have his own philosophy. It's mentioned particularly when he's talking about learning languages, when Toru comes into his room one night and he sees him learning French, and it's like, yeah, dude, I've learned 4 languages while everybody else is sitting around on their ass jacking off. And that sort of sense of philosophy, that sort of sense of duty is very impressive if it isn't heartless. And I think that nuance is important to his character, because it's something I've not only seen indicative in Japanese society, but I've seen it in a lot of sort of successful people with a lot of money who have this kind of attitude of, I worked hard and other people just need to work hard too. Where the one thing that I think, because there are situations where there are absolutely Nepo babies, I'm not denying that, but there are people who have worked very, very hard for their money and for their success. And while it's very easy for them to miss the luck side of things, it's also very easy for other people to not appreciate the amount of work that they put into it. So in that sense, Nagasawa is representative of a very specific type of elite. At the same time, back when they were friends, back in the prequel romance story, it's mentioned that Naoko went to a rich girl school and would constantly try to set Toru up with a bunch of rich girls, and he could never relate to them, never connect with them. And at the same time, later on, with Nagasawa and Hatsumi, who is Nagasawa's girlfriend, once again, she tries to set him up with a bunch of rich girls, but this time he just refuses out of hand, saying that I want nothing to do with them. And yet, Naoko was a rich girl, and Hatsumi is a rich girl, and he likes Hatsumi very much. Hatsumi is shown to be a very good and decent person who has her own tragic fate with death, again underscoring the constant theme of death. But also how it's so easy to sort of bundle class together and judge people based that way. But then there are those among the sort of upper class who are caring, who are vulnerable and everything. Even if they are the minority, I really appreciate the way that in this book, which is hypercritical of class, Midori, again, in her struggles, not only with life, mentions going to a rich girl's high school. And she mentions the difference between when a rich girl says, I can't afford it, versus when she says she can't afford something. The difference is that she really cannot afford it, which I think it's very simple, but again, just very poignant in pointing out or in highlighting that sort of dichotomy and the sort of shallowness of these social movements and the sort of omnipresence of class and how it divides people and how it sets certain people up. The difference between the commune that Naoko is in, which is mentioned, you do have to have quite a bit of money to go there, and the hospital in which Midori's father dies, is yet another stark contrast. And the fact that those chapters come back to back, I think is very poignant. I think it's meant to highlight not just Midori's struggles, which, by the way, is just yet another thing that made me further appreciate Midori's strength as a person, as a character, but also the sort of unfairness. Not that I think that Murakami is, necessarily trying to portray the commune as a bad thing, or that the people in the commune are all just a bunch of rich assholes. Again, I think the book is more than that, but rather how unfortunate it is that this sort of disparity exists between the two. And while the class thing never really quite comes to a head in the same way that the life or death thing does, I think it gets summed up best in chapter 10 at the second paragraph. Time itself slogged along in rhythm with my faltering steps. The people around me had gone on ahead long before, while my time and I hung back, struggling through the mud. The world around me was on the verge of great transformations. Death had already taken John Coltrane, who was joined now by so many others. People screamed there'd be revolutionary changes, which always seemed to be just ahead at the curve in the road. but the changes that came were just two-dimensional stage sets, background without substance or meaning. I think that ends up being a sort of summation of the class, of the revolutions, of the shallowness of it. In my Vineland review, I mentioned reading, and there is a sort of short story from Murakami that reviews sort of the failing of the hippie generation, how that time went from belief in peace and love, and how it really failed to manifest in any way. And I think you sort of see that here. You see a lot of the shallowness, you see a lot of the emptiness. And while it's not the theme of the book, like I said, it's not necessarily a theme that necessarily has any major conclusion. Going back to what I said about the movie, if you were to make a movie adaptation of this book and miss that theme, miss what Nagasawa and Hatsumi bring to the table as characters, you end up with something that is not Norwegian Wood, because even if you just read it for the romance, the fact that there are other things going on in the book is what, for me, and I've mentioned this before in my past reviews, separates it from a lot of romance novels. Where I really struggle and get frustrated with romance novels is when the characters have nothing going on in their lives except for these romances, and I just want to throttle the characters, like, just get a fucking life. Like, you know, when they're spending all their days just thinking about, you know, well, what does she think? Is she thinking about me? Oh, I screwed that up, or blah, blah, blah. And it's like, but there's so much more going on. Life goes on. And it's, if you were to strip everything else away from Norwegian Wood and focus on the romance, you get that exact hollow problem. And it's the fact that there's so much else going on that means that I do believe that even if people don't necessarily appreciate that, even if people don't necessarily recognize it, I think on some level, they recognize it, they feel it in the story, they feel that there's something more going on here, even if they don't necessarily have the analytical chops to articulate it. I think, to use the old red letter media adage, you might not have noticed, but your brain did. And that sums up Norwegian Wood in a whole. Like I said, I've read it a few times, and reading it again this time with this kind of approach really opened up new dimensions for me, made everything lock into place, and made me appreciate it way more than I had before. It made me appreciate magical realism, really, because I've mentioned that I like magical realism and surrealism for the sort of symbology and the interpretation that they bring to things, but that I'm not necessarily limited to it, because you can very much have stories that still have that sort of symbology and interpretation. And one of the descriptions of magical realism that I heard goes back to a podcast called Writing Excuses, and it's a very, very old episode at this point, where you know, I'll do her the credit of pausing and looking up her name. Hold up. Mary Robinette Cole described it as the metaphor made real. And I've always kind of struggled with that. It feels like it kind of does, but it kind of doesn't. And I think sort of my personal understanding after coming away with Norwegian Wood is, even though it doesn't have the magical realism or the surrealism of Murakami's other novels, it has all of the symbolism, all of the metaphor there. And I would say that it's really sort of magical realism is when the symbolism becomes manifest in the story. And you might call that the metaphor made real, but I think there's a slight nuance difference there. Maybe it's just semantics. I don't know. But there really is the amount of layers and the amount of depth and the amount of interpretation, I feel, in Norwegian Wood that there is to Murakami's other works. And that if it seems like a more straightforward story, then it is simply by the nature of the story itself and not the absence of those elements. There's a lot of layers here. It is a fantastic story. Absolutely recommend it. And I don't think I have anything else to say on it other than great time, great story. And I hope that even if you don't agree with me, I have helped you consider the book in a new light. So until next time, take care.